Welcome to the Keto Geek Podcast. Let's do this.
Health, nutrition, fitness, low-carb lifestyle.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to the Keto Geek Podcast. My name is Fahad, and I am the host of this show. If I sound a little different and a little tired, it's mostly because I am currently in Abu Dhabi recording this tiny introduction at 5 o'clock in the morning with practically no caffeine, no sleep, and with equipment that definitely does not resemble the current equipment that I use for recording. This is just a basic lavalier microphone in front of me that is doing all the recording and the bulk work. But it's been an interesting excursion for me for the last 5 to 6 days as I've been traveling. And I have to say, the energy pods have been one of my best friends. For those who are new to this show, Keto Geek, our company makes these tiny little energy pods that are keto-friendly snacks that you can take with you. And in fact, some of you people use it to boost your performances. I've seen some people mix it with coffee, froth it up, especially the chocolate fudge energy pod that we have, and consume it before their workouts just to get a little bit of a boost. So I'll try that myself and see how that pans out. I do tend to do that quite often, where I'll take one of the pods, specifically the chocolate fudge energy pod, mix it with coffee. I think I'm stumbling here a little too much. But yeah, I'll do that, and I'll use that as a pick-me-up during the day. It works out great. And speaking of good stuff, the energy pods are currently available on Amazon for limited supply, so the link to Amazon will be in the show notes, so you can go ahead and purchase the energy pods there. And please do leave us a review over there. That will mean quite a bit. Additionally, Keto Delivered and Keto Crate are both featuring the energy pods, specifically the chocolate fudge energy pod in their May box. They're both really cool and kick-ass people who are providing these snack boxes, sample boxes for keto. And definitely check them out if you're interested in getting just a bunch of really cool keto-friendly snacks in front of your doorstep every single month. So yeah, besides that, guys and gals, this was a really fascinating podcast for me. I had read Thor Hanson's book, The Triumph of Seeds, quite a few months ago, and some of you people who follow me or follow us on Instagram probably saw this during one of our story posts, and I was really fascinated and driven to it. There's not a lot of books that talk about the evolution of seeds, plants, and just basically where did this whole madness begin? Where did food begin? How did plants start to encapsulate these energy-dense seedlings and throw them out for other plants to grow? And this was a question very important to me because we at Keto Geek, we do use nuts in all our products. And so we wanted to go back in time, see what's been going on, how have seeds and nuts and all of these foods changed, and what kind of role do they play in the ecology? Guys and gals, this is hands down one of the best podcasts we have done to date. Thor Hanson is an amazing guy, and you guys will definitely enjoy this one, especially if you've enjoyed the previous episodes we've done. I would say this is one of the legendary podcasts. That's how I would rate it. Just to give you guys a little bit of a backstory on Thor Hanson. Who exactly is he? Well, author and biologist Thor Hanson is a Guggenheim Fellow, a Switzer Environmental Fellow, and winner of the John Burroughs Medal. His books include The Impenetrable Forest, Feathers, The Triumph of Seeds, and Buzz, which is due in July of 2018, as well as the illustrated children's favorite, Bartholomew, I suck at this, don't I? Bartholomew Quill. Thor's work has been translated into more than 10 languages and earned many accolades, including the Phi Beta Kappa Award, the AAAS Subaru Prize, and 2 Pacific Northwest Book Awards. His many media appearances have included NPR's Fresh Air, PRI's Science Friday, Book Lust with Nancy Pearl, and The Current on CBC. Hanson currently lives with his wife and son on the island in Pacific Northwest. Ladies and gentlemen, let me bring to you this legendary podcast with Thor Hanson. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Thor Hanson on our podcast today. He is in the same time zone as we are here in California. Thor, how are you doing today?
I am doing just fine, Fahad. Thanks for calling.
My pleasure. I have been looking forward to this interview for a few months now, ever since I read your book, which is The Triumph of Seeds, and it is a fascinating book. Personally, I think it's a wonderful way to explore the evolution of seeds, nuts, and all these kind of, and even spores. I think you talk about those too, and how they have been part of our evolutionary history. So my first question to you would be, how did your intrigue, or how did you start this journey into researching all of this, everything about nuts and seeds and all those kind of things?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. I began my interest in seeds specifically when I was doing my doctoral work, and I was studying these large rainforest trees down in Central America, and I was studying how the fragmentation of the rainforest there was affecting populations of trees. And so I wanted to know how that affected gene flow among trees. So I was looking at the dispersal of pollen, and I was looking at the dispersal of seeds. I did a lot of work out in the forest gathering seeds and doing genetic fingerprinting and finding out how far they had traveled and how they were moving around. And, did the whole study and the whole thesis and published the papers. And at the end of all of that, I had this moment where I realized, I really don't know how these things work. I realized I really didn't understand the biology of seeds in spite of all of this research. What is going on in these little packages? How do they survive? How do they germinate? What are the strategies they use to, disperse across the landscape? All these fascinating questions. I hadn't even scratched the surface, even, doing all of this research. And so that got me started then doing a real deep dive into seeds, into what makes them so successful in nature, and then how those very same things make us just utterly dependent upon them.
Okay. So this is a common running question that I ask a lot of people that show up to the show. How do you do your research? What kind of resources do you use? And how do you educate yourself?
Yeah. So again, this began with a very, from a very scientific standpoint, and my training is in biology and botany, and that's often how I begin these projects, is something fairly technical. And then on top of that, I add a lot of hard work looking at research that other people have done and talking to those people, seeking them out and learning not only about their results, but about what was it that drew them to the topic in the first place, the fascination, that sort of underlying curiosity that drives all of us to do what we do. And then another aspect of these projects is the cultural aspect. And that often sneaks up on me, because I am a scientist by training, and I start out generally from that perspective. But every project I've done, and certainly with the research on seeds, I've been just blown away by the layer upon layer of cultural connections that we have to these fascinating objects. I mean, and with seeds, it just runs as deep as you want to go, the layers of connections that we have to seeds in terms of food sources and sources for medicines and sources for industrial products. Almost anything you can imagine, we use these marvelous natural things for, and all of those uses trace back to some interesting, biological and evolutionary question.
Fantastic. You talk about something called cultural connection here. Would you like to elaborate what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, if you consider something as common in our cultural practices as the practice of at many Western weddings now, throwing rice upon the bride and groom after the ceremony. And you can even trace it to things like the wedding cake, which that began as a sharing of grains, of seeds, and originally in simple form, and then in more elaborate cakes over the centuries. But this idea of sharing seeds at a wedding is almost universal around the world, and there are stories of the ancient Romans throwing wheat grains, and there are places in the world where they share millet or rice or sorghum or a whole variety of seeds, and it is something that we hardly pause to think about, but that traces to a wonderful tradition where a wedding symbolized not only the joining of families, but the sharing of their seed varieties, because as agricultural people around the world, we have developed a huge variety of locally adapted seeds for almost any crop that you can think of. There are thousands of varieties adapted to specific conditions in particular parts of the world, and families had their own seed varieties. And so when people got married, it was very common for the families to contribute seeds, which were symbolic, of course, of fertility and this sort of thing, but also were very practical in that they could be planted. And so it was the passing of accumulated agricultural knowledge in these very specific seed varieties from one generation down to the next, and makes for a very deep cultural connection then between people and between these natural objects upon which we rely.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the question I've been itching to ask you for many, many months now. And it's a pretty general question. Where did it all begin?
Oh, where did it all begin for seeds? Oh, man, it is a great question, and one that takes us back hundreds of millions of years, really back to the Devonian, maybe 400 million years ago, when there were no seed plants, when the flora of our planet was dominated by spore plants that had a different reproductive strategy entirely. And those plants, or the descendants of them, I should say, are still with us. They're still a part of our flora, but now they're, less than 5% of the flora, where they used to be the entire flora around the world. And seed plants, when they did come along, were just very minor players. So you saw this over time, this complete transformation where after their evolution, the seed plants eventually dominated the flora, and the spore plants now are minor players. So the spore plants, if you think of something like a fern or a horsetail, these are the spore plants, and they reproduce in a very different way. When a spore plant, like a fern, reproduces, it sends off spores that are ultimately, clones of that plant itself. There's been no mixing of genes at that point. The spores head off from the plant and they land somewhere in the soil, and they grow into a separate plant that we never even see. People aren't even familiar with these little plants for something like a fern. And it's a separate generation called the gametophyte. And it is that little plant, it's only about the size of the nail on your pinky finger for most ferns, is another plant that produces the eggs and sperm, if you will, that then swim through the muddy soil right there around that little plant and get fertilized and grow into a new fern as we know it. So you have this complicated system. It works just fine. Spore plants have been around for a long time. But there are certain advantages when you begin to step in the direction of making seeds. And the first step in that direction is to differentiate between we'll use the terms male and female. They're not exactly accurate for plants, but people use them all the time anyway. It does make intuitive sense to us as a species with male and female. So if you separate out the male spores then from the female spores, you start making two kinds of spores. You're taking the first step towards seeds. And this has happened in a number of different spore plants. There are spore plants now like some water ferns and spike mosses that have taken this step. And what that allows then is for you to have big fat female spores into which you can start packing a bit of nutrition. And the reason for doing so is so that when they are fertilized, they have some nutrition already packed away that allows them to grow and feed off of that for the first part of their life. And that's where you start to see the beginnings of seeds. So if you look at these ancient spore plants that took this step and led towards seeds, they had female spores that started getting larger and larger and male spores that started evolving towards what now we think of as pollen in the seed plants. So you had that separation take place. And then the other great thing that happened that was necessary is that those ancient seed plants, those first seed plants, held on to the female spores, and they let the female part grow right there on the parent plant. And they made the pollen, that tiny little spores that were revolving towards pollen, those were the ones that dispersed at that stage. And originally, generally by wind, and then later carried around by animals and this sort of thing. But once you take that step, then you're really getting close to evolving a seed, because you have this female spore growing into its separate generation right there on the parent plant, and the male spores moving around in a pollen-like fashion. And then all you really need to do is start putting a little bit of window dressing on that female gametophyte stage, and it turns into what we think of as a seed.
Wow, I have so many questions I can ask you. Just want to let you know you're probably going to return to this show pretty soon. When did animals, if you know, start eating plants as a source of energy? Has that always existed? Or is that a recent development? And seems like animals prefer certain plants to others, and including insects. So where did this madness begin? Any ideas?
Oh yeah, it goes way back, and it's a very deceptive thing for us. You know, those of us who live at sort of a different in a different frame of reference, in a different time frame of reference than something like a stationary plant, a tree or a shrub or an herb that's sitting there in a very different frame of reference. But we look at something like a forest or a beautiful field of wildflowers, and we think of it as this peaceful setting, when in fact it's not peaceful at all. It is red in tooth and claw as the rest of nature. There's all sorts of competition going on. And if you start to think about the consumption of plant matter by animals, it goes all the way back. As soon as you start fixing energy in the form of carbohydrates through photosynthesis, you know, that first step of plant evolution, or a very key step of plant evolution, what you have there is a source of energy then packed into, whether it's an algae or whether it's the leaf of a plant. And as soon as you do that, something's going to figure out that it can use that energy to fuel its own body. And so you have then really an arms race developing from the very beginning between consumers and the producers. So the producers of energy being the plants, and the consumers being all of the animals, not just, you know, something like a wildebeest roaming the Serengeti, but you know, all sorts of tiny consumers as well that we hardly even think of or see. You know, microscopic creatures that also consume plants, you know, and then all of the more familiar forms. So as soon as you have energy contained in plants, you have creatures that are going to want to eat them. And as soon as that happens, then you have this defensive strategy on the part of the plants, developing all sorts of defenses to keep themselves from being eaten, which of course spurs the consumers to evolve ways to get around those defenses. A long, long history of consumption of plant matter by animals. And it's the perfect setting, if you think about it, for the development of chemical defenses in plants. Because if you think about, think about the way we cook. And if we're making a dish that has meat in it, generally speaking, we add plant matter of some kind to give the meat more flavor. We add pepper, which comes to us from, a little, from the seeds and fruits of a little plant in the pepper family, native to, black pepper, native to the coast of the Malabar coast of India, or if we're using chili peppers, native to South and Central America. We add plant matter to meat because plants are spicy. We get spices from plants, and that has to do with defenses. The idea that if you are a fundamentally stationary organism like a plant, you don't have the same suite of options that an animal would have when attacked. If a hawk dives on a small bird, that bird can flap its own wings and get away. Or if a lion chases that wildebeest out in the Serengeti, the wildebeest can run away. It can, or if it's a group of wildebeest, they can turn and defend themselves. They have all of these options because they are mobile. Whereas plants are stationary. So to defend themselves, they have hundreds of millions of years of experience developing chemical defenses. Chemicals that will make them taste bitter. Chemicals that can be poisonous to a consumer, or that can make a consumer feel full before a consumer is technically full. All of these different chemical combinations to defend themselves. And many of those, to us, have flavors that make plants interesting to eat. The spices that we use can be traced to chemical defenses, and also our pharmaceuticals and medicinal uses of plants, often traced to those chemical defenses that have their origins deep in botanical history. As soon as plants had energy that was worth exploiting, there were consumers trying to get it, and the plants had to do something to defend themselves.
How did you humans enter into the fray of consuming plants, and specifically seeds?
So the human consumption of plants, our evolutionary history as a species dates back at least 250,000 years to sub-Saharan Africa, and our ancestors before that in the same genus date back 2 or 3 million years in that landscape. And if you start looking then for the origin of our dietary practices, they date far back into the prehistory of our species. You start talking about primates like our Australopithecus, as well as all of the different members of our own genus Homo that were alive at one point in time, many of them alive at the same time. We are the sole survivors of this particular lineage, but there have been many iterations over the years, and all of them, of course, using plants for a good part of their diet. Because plants are around. Plants are the basis of the entire food chain on the planet. You have to have something able to fix energy originally from the sun, and it's the plants that do that. So you can trace them, as the basis of food chains. And certainly our ancestors were right there amongst the other apes, eating a whole variety of plant matter, a whole variety of leaves, fruits, bark, all of the sorts of things that you see even now in the diet of wild primates, or in the diets of the few groups that are still living a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And if you look at that transition that went then from the hunter-gatherer towards our modern sort of agricultural-based lifestyle, the agricultural revolution, which took place in repeatedly in different parts of the world, but beginning, 10 to 15,000 years ago in the Near East, you can track the use of plants by looking through, archaeological records, the strata in the soil, and see what plants people were using and how those changed as we moved from getting our sustenance from the landscape around us to relying on a far more limited number of plant species. But there's a marvelous site in modern day Syria that was very fully excavated and showed this transition, which we were sort of led to believe, casually thinking, oh, well, we figured out how to grow crops and the agricultural revolution. That sounds like something quick. We just did that overnight in response to, our changing habits, but not at all. It took, in that particular instance, this one site that was inhabited more or less continuously from hunter-gatherer bands on up through a Neolithic, an early agricultural village. It took between 1,000 and 2,000 years. And over that course of that time, you can see how people went from using hundreds of wild species to narrowing it down to the 10 or 20 plant species that could be easily cultivated and provided the most bang for the buck, if you will. And seeds, of course, were a huge part of making that decision. What are the grains, for example, that have the fattest seeds naturally, that make the most sense to invest your time in as someone gathering from the landscape and make sense then to plant and domesticate. Similarly, what are the fruits that have those characteristics? What are the nuts that have those characteristics? And so you see a very logical progression, if you will, from wild to domesticated. But we've been using ancestors of those plants for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years.
So here's another question I've been craving to ask you is, how have the seeds changed over time, all the way from the good old days to right now, and in between we threw in the agricultural revolution as well?
Yeah. This again, if you think about how an archaeologist arriving at a new research site tries to determine when agriculture began for those people. They do their excavations and they sift through the soil and they're looking for, all of the signs of human habitation. But when they are curious about the beginnings of agriculture, they are specifically looking at seeds. And what they are looking for that shows up time and again at sites around the world is a sudden change in the size of seeds. You look at a wild seed showing up and in those soil layers, and it's a small seed. People are gathering it, they're using it from the wild, and then all of a sudden the seeds start getting bigger. And that is when you see selection beginning to take place. Initially, selection from wild varieties. If you're going to be gathering from the wild and there is variety in that species, you're going to quickly learn which plants or which habitats where that plant occurs make the biggest seeds, because you get more for your effort. And people they quickly realize this. So this happens again and again. And once you see that selection taking place, people are looking for the bigger seeds to eat from the wild. And then, of course, if you're going to start planting seeds or cultivating wild seeds in some fashion, you're going to favor those big ones that are giving you more bang for the buck. And then soon after that, you can start to see a rapid increase as people, again, select the largest seeds to plant out. You can do this in your own, window box or backyard by growing up a row of, tomatoes, or grow up a row of corn, or whatever you want to grow, even of our modern varieties, and grow up a row for seed production. And when you do that, if you have several plants, you're going to see variety. There's just natural genetic variability in any of these species, even after all of this domestication and selection that we've done over the years. There's just natural variability there. And it really struck home for me personally once when we were looking through seed corn. We had my wife's grandfather had grown corn for seed to grind up, and make porridge and this sort of thing. And my young son and I were, taking the seeds off of those corn cobs. And that can be pretty hard work with dried corn. You really have to force it on some of them. And then we'd get to the occasional ear of corn where the seeds would just come off easily, and they were big and they were fat. And you immediately understand that, if I were saving seed to plant next year, I would be saving these ones that are easy to process. This is what I would want to plant because those are the characteristics that I want in a future harvest. It's plain as day if you do it yourself now, and it was as plain as day to our ancestors over time, over all of these generations of planting, that you save the seeds of the individual plants that have the characteristics that you want in the next generation.
Do we know if the chemical composition has varied as well, and the nutrient composition?
Yeah. So again, if there is something very simply that you can see, a fatter seed or a nut that's larger, you're getting more nutrition out of that. That's the first step. And then it gets more complicated as people became more sophisticated with their agriculture and began deliberately crossing plants. Once the process of pollination was well understood, then people began to purposely cross the plants with particular traits that they wanted. And so that then became a two-step process. You are looking not only for the characteristics, when you are gathering the seed to plant for the next generation among a generation, but then you can manipulate particular traits through plant breeding to bring out certain characteristics. And there's a whole suite of those that we see in fruits and in seeds and in nuts that people have sought after, over the generations. And those are, for many crops, less bitterness. We talked earlier about how plants defend themselves with chemicals. Well, there's variety in the level of bitterness in any species. And so if you are looking to make a crop out of something, you want it tasty, you begin selecting or breeding for a less bitter variety. You can breed for things like the size and the amount of starch in a grain. You can breed. You start to select. You see the variety in your row, and you start to select then for future generations the characteristics that you want, and those can include and do include many chemical characteristics as well.
Does bitterness correlate with some sort of toxicity by any chance?
Yeah, so bitterness comes from, there are several different chemical pathways that will create it in plants, and from the plant's perspective, it's trying to make itself unpalatable. And so it can mean toxic, and one of the reasons that we recognize it and we stop eating things that are horribly bitter is because our bodies recognize it as something potentially dangerous. So there is a link between, may not be an acute toxin, but about something that is bad for us to eat. We recognize that, and there's a long evolutionary history of this that can make for some extremely intricate interactions. I mean, if you think about something as simple as the bitterness in an apple before it is ripe, I mean, we know this. If you go out to an orchard in the middle of summer, while the apples are small and still developing, you try to eat one, it's horribly bitter. You don't want to eat that at all. Yet if you go back to that very same tree in September or October when the apples are ripe, suddenly they're sweet. They're sweet. The plant is luring you in with this delicious flesh. So what's the difference? Well, it all, in that case, has to do with the seeds inside, and that the sweetness of that flesh is a dispersal strategy. So the plant is playing both sides here. While the seeds are young, before they're mature, before they could be dispersed successfully, the fruit is bitter to keep you from eating it. But as soon as the seeds are mature and ready to be dispersed, the fruit turns sweet to attract you to the fruit so that you will disperse the seeds. So the nuances of this, and there are, innumerable examples for dispersal as well as, defense and all of these other characteristics that we could chat about. They can be extremely clever, and tightly connected to the habits of the disperser or the creature you're trying to lure in. It's really quite marvelous. But you can see that then in the chemistry of an apple, if you will. Bitter when the seeds are immature, sweet when the seeds are ready to go.
Wow. This brings us to a very interesting sort of existential question, which is, have plants domesticated us, or have we domesticated plants, or is it just a symbiotic relationship?
Isn't it? It's fun to think about that, isn't it? But if you look at crop plants, the big crop plants, there's a great argument to be made that we have been players, in the success of these plants as a species, giving them domination over huge parts of the world where they never even would have existed without our interference. So, if you look at potatoes evolving in the mountains of South America and through our love of potatoes, spreading them around the world, or you look at the chili pepper, the same idea, or you look at wheat, or you look at rice, and we have moved these plants from where they evolved, and we have bred them, and we have nurtured them, and coddled them, and helped them spread across millions of acres on all the inhabited continents. It's a pretty convincing success story from the plant's perspective.
It reminds me of how the dogs how we domesticated the dogs as well. It's a symbiotic relationship where they became man's best friend. Sounds like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and dogs are a fun example as well when you think of the variety of dogs. Sometimes it's hard for us to get our heads around the variety that is there in a particular species of plant. But if you look at dogs, you look at everything from a Chihuahua up to a Great Dane, and all of that variety has been bred into dogs from, the domesticated wolf over, a period of 40 or 50,000 years, right? That's pretty incredible if you can go from a wolf to a Chihuahua or, a Shih Tzu or a Great Dane or a Scottish Terrier. All of these hundreds of very distinct-looking dog varieties in, a few tens of thousands of years. Well, think of what you can do with plants, over huge periods of time as well.
You, my friend, need a podcast, by the way. You have so much information, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface on so many different topics. Are there certain seeds that still resemble their ancient architecture, or has everything just been so drastically changed?
Oh, well, that's a terrific question. In general, they do very much resemble their progenitors in the wild, and very often we know what those wild ancestors were, but not always. So in some ways, the interesting thing to do is to sort of flip your question around and look for the mystery seeds, and there are a whole number of them. The history of corn remains a bit mysterious. People are pretty sure now what wild grass it came from, but it has changed so dramatically that it's very hard to be entirely sure. Or you look at the history of wheat, and we know pretty well the wild grasses that it came from, but there are a whole bunch of interesting breeding events and what they call polyploidy, which is a technical term for the doubling of the chromosomes or the changing of the chromosome number in a plant. Oh, that has gone on in wheat, making it a bit mysterious. Or you look at something where the familiar domesticate, like an avocado, has no clear wild ancestor, and it may be possible that the ancestral avocado disappeared from the wild, and fabulous theories about why that may have occurred, but the avocado, with its massive seed and very thin skin, very poor defenses on the part of the seed, nothing that would prevent it from being chewed up or damaged if a big creature ate it, has led people to think that perhaps the wild ancestor to avocados was one of these great, what they call, the megafauna, the large animals that went extinct in Central and Northern America at the close of the last ice age. Great extinction of the megafauna. And if you had some Gomphotherium or one of these large herbivores that could swallow a wild avocado whole and digest it, get the flesh off it that way, and then disperse the seed through its dung, well, that process stopped as soon as those animals were gone. And so the theory for something like an avocado now is that it was domesticated by people sort of in the nick of time, in that the wild species was disappearing because its dispersers were disappearing, and it persists now only in its domesticated form. There are relatives of avocados in the wild, but no clear specific ancestor to the avocado that we know and love. So you can flip that question in all sorts of ways and get some interesting answers. Generally speaking, we can find the wild relatives, but not always.
Wow. Humans potentially saved the avocados. That's a first I'm hearing. Okay. Are there any other plants that humans saved from extinction? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's one example. And again, an interesting theory of what may have occurred there. There are, if we look around now, one of the challenges, of course, that we see in seeds is the idea of saving varieties of seed that we may be losing, and that's occurring in several ways. One, in terms of the change in agriculture, change in agricultural practices over particularly the last 100 years or so, where we've gone from growing a huge variety of different kinds of, tomatoes or wheat or sorghum or whatever these different crops may have been, all individually adapted to particular landscapes. We've gone from that to growing a very few varieties on a grand scale in a more industrial farming setting. And so in doing that, making that transformation, we have developed ways for producing huge harvests, but have done so at the expense of many of those varieties. So there's a great seed-saving movement going on now, banking seeds and trying to find all of these varieties. Many of them have been lost, but finding the ones that are still out there and saving them so that we have those varieties for the future for plant breeding and for adapting to changes in agriculture and also changes in the environment. Climate change, of course, bringing rapid changes to many farming areas, and we need to have a variety of plants that we can breed and try to grow in these changing conditions. So there's that aspect of seed saving going on, where people are looking to save domesticated varieties. And as a part of that, also looking for these wild ancestors of our crop seeds and saving those, so we have this huge genetic variability. And then at the same time, we see a great loss of wild species through climate change in some cases, and also particularly through just the loss of habitat. Massive loss of habitat for wild species, whether they are in grasslands that have been converted to agricultural uses, or whether they are seed plants growing in rainforests that have been cut for timber or to create pasture or agricultural land. All sorts of habitats that are in decline, and we're losing seed plant species in that process. So there's another aspect of seed saving, particularly being led by a seed bank at Kew Gardens in the United Kingdom, where their seed bank is trying very hard to preserve wild plants. And there are already examples, several dozen examples of seeds that are in those seed banks that have gone extinct now in the wild. And so the last repository has become, these seeds saved in a seed bank, and which of course hopefully will allow, conservation of them and then reintroduction at some point in the future when, if we can bring their habitat back.
Is there something catastrophic that could happen with the loss of some specific seeds or plants from Earth?
Yeah, great question. So the catastrophes again occur in. You can sort of divide these things out. The agricultural catastrophes, which are things that people feel immediately, and then the catastrophe of losing wild species, which have other implications for us over a longer term. But if you look at how reliant we are upon a small number of crop plants, and if you start to think of what would happen if we lost those crops, in terms of our species being able to feed itself, you can see immediate catastrophic results, not just economically, but nutritionally for our species if we start losing things, like rice or like wheat or any of our staples that provide the bulk of the calories in the human diet. So there would be immediate catastrophe to lose those species. And you can see, examples of that through history and the implications that have occurred when you look at, famines and their political and social ramifications. Well, those famines, they trace back to agricultural catastrophes. What happened when crops failed, and they may have failed due to climate conditions, they may have failed due to disease, plant diseases, crop diseases, fungal diseases, all sorts of things that may have affected crops, and the famines that result have huge, and continue to have huge political ramifications and cultural ramifications for our species. So very, very clear connections can be made between crop problems, plant problems, if you will, and human problems. And then, of course, loss of wild species has a more subtle to us, but also very, critical long-term effects in that we lose all of the potential of those plants, the uses they have for us, and then also lose all of the ecological and ecosystem services that those habitats and those plants within them have been providing to us that we rarely include in our, economic calculations.
Awesome. Wow. This is a full-blown system that needs to be viewed from several different magnifying glasses. Thanks for that. Thanks for this new outlook. And now you've got me thinking while I'm doing this podcast, which is a bit unique. But let's go let's go back to this one interesting question which I had, a pretty dummy question on my part, which is when I eat a nut, it tastes really good to me. Is there an evolutionary, not taste, but that crunch that you get tastes really good? Is there some evolutionary science behind it or a reason behind it why crunchy things like those really taste good?
Oh, great question. So there are a couple of ways to answer that. And if you think about human evolution, there's an interesting theory about why we look the way we do. Why are we moving around in bodies like ours? There are a whole bunch of theories of this. But particularly if you look at the evolution of the human skull and the shape of the human face, you can quickly find our genus, Homo, in a row of skulls, and you can see these rows of skulls in any, anthropology textbook. But if you look at Australopithecus and some of these earlier, bipedal apes from of which we descend and which we're related to, and then compare those even to further back to, the gorillas and the chimpanzees and other ape species, there's a shape of the skull with a very protruding looking jaw. And this is why if kids are trying to pretend to look like apes, they take an orange wedge, and put it in their mouth and go hooting around. Because it makes our mouths protrude. It makes the jaw look as if it's protruding and gives us a more ape-like appearance. We are still apes, of course, but but traditionally ape-like appearance. But the human face, our genus, has a flatness to it with a different structure. And one of the theories for how that came about has to do with what was being reinforced in terms of the bone structure of the face when it became flat. And if you there's some interesting papers on this, but they've run computer simulations of where the stress is when we bite on particular things. So if you think about that nut that you're talking about and how you chew a nut, if you have something hard and crunchy, you don't use your very front teeth to crunch it up because they feel fragile. You can chip those teeth. They're not it's a bad experience. You don't want to crush things with your front teeth. They're too vulnerable. You can crush things with your rear teeth. You've got strength in the jaw back there, but if you think about how you're going to crunch a nut, say get the shell off of a nut, most likely people use the teeth, the premolars, right on the side of the mouth, right? This is where we have real strength structurally in our skull for cracking something in a convenient fashion. You can put a peanut or what have you, you can put the shell right there, easily crack it, and open that nut and get at the crunchy bits inside. The crunchy, tasty bits. And if you look at the human skull in terms of evolution, strengthening the pillars of bone that support that particular motion will flatten the face. Okay, and so there's the theory out there that the ability to crack hard seeds, including various nuts, may have been part of the reason that our face is flattened from that traditional protruding ape-like face, in that if you have that ability to crack open hard seeds and get the nutrition out of them, it gives you an advantage, particularly in times when food is scarce. And we don't always think about this in evolutionary terms. We tend to think that the traits that we have are adapted to the things we do most often. But that's not always the case, in that there's a great evolutionary pressure during times that are unusual, during times of scarcity in food, for example. And if you have an ability, your lineage has an ability to survive those harsh times because you can crack more seeds, with the shape of your skull and mouth, that then might give you an advantage that leads your lineage to persist. And so it's oftentimes, some of these traits that give us an edge, or gives animals and plants and other creatures in general an edge during the unusual times in their existence that persist, or that have a great potential to change something like the shape of a skull or some very recognizable feature. It can happen pretty quickly when there's a distinct advantage during the hard times.
Fascinating. So how come I can consume seeds, but I can't consume the rest of the plant? Why does that happen?
Oh, yeah, good question. So, there are a whole bunch of different strategies here and a whole bunch of different evolutionary paths that can be taken. But let's just continue with your nut example as one possibility and one strategy. Why is that nut so delicious and tasty? Because if you think about it, it doesn't make any bloody sense at all. If you are a plant and your goal is to try to disperse your seeds to make new plants, and you've invested all of this energy into a fat, juicy nut, why let an animal eat it? Shouldn't be full of those bitter toxins that we were talking about earlier? You don't want an animal to devour your baby, which is essentially what's happening in that situation. And so for something like a nut, there's a very interesting evolutionary balancing act going on from the plant's perspective, in that for many types of seeds, a plant will use a fleshy fruit to get it dispersed, right? The animal will eat the fruit, the seed will be unharmed and either pooped out or left behind in an unpalatable core or something like that. And the seed is saved in that regard. Or the seed is held within a very hard interior shell at the center of that fruit that won't be damaged by chewing. But if you look at something, like many of the nuts that are out there, the nut itself is attractive to the creatures that are going to do the dispersing, because they're attractive to things like squirrels or mice or a whole variety of rodents and pigs and creatures that want to actually eat the seed. And so from the plant's perspective, you have to be clever to get the job done, because you're not using a fruit necessarily. You are using your babies. You're using your seeds to attract a disperser. And this leads to situations where you are relying upon a very complex ecological setting. If you consider, what we traditionally think of as a nut, like say a walnut or something like that. In nature, where that particular style of nut evolved, you're probably looking at something like a squirrel doing a lot of the dispersing. So the walnuts become ripe, the squirrels are in there, they are grabbing walnuts right and left. But we all know that squirrels have a habit of storing food for later. They cache it. The C-A-C-H-E is the word, caching it, meaning they tuck it away someplace and they're going to come back and get that nut and eat it later on. And they do that for several reasons. One, they've got this bounty of food while the nut tree is fruiting, producing all these nuts, but they want to save some for the season when they don't have nuts. So they're storing them for later, but they're also getting themselves the heck away from that tree. Because if you are a hawk or an owl or a wild cat of some kind and you want a squirrel to eat, you know bloody well the best place to find them is around a nut tree where the squirrels are going to look for nuts. And so there's this great ecological setting going on, and all of the components of it are essential for the nut dispersal strategy to work. So the nut has to be tasty enough to make a squirrel want to eat it, but it has to be inconvenient enough so that the squirrel is not going to sit there in the tree and eat it. It has to take time, right? And if you think about a squirrel eating a walnut, it's got to chew its way through that hard shell, and then it's got to figure out a way to prize out the nut from within. And if you think of a walnut, it has that really complicated, almost brain-like looking structure to it, and they're hard to get out of the shell, and they're hard for a reason. And the reason is the strategy from the plant's standpoint is to increase what they call the handling time for that nut. It takes a long time to get the nutrition out of it, to get that delicious nut meat out, because you don't want the creature that's eating it to simply pop it open and eat it right there on the spot. Because doing so encourages then the creature to get someplace safe where it has the time it needs to handle that nut and get the nutrition out of it. So the squirrel has to get the nut and then get the heck away from the tree and either stash it or consume it in a safe location elsewhere. And if you can rely on that, over a long period of evolutionary time, the nut strategy works pretty well, because of course squirrels are going to forget some of the places they've cached those nuts. And also, some of the squirrels are, in fact, going to get eaten by the hawks and the owls and the wild cats and other things, and the dogs and everything else that would love to eat a squirrel. And when the squirrel is killed, all of its cached nuts are forgotten, and some of those then have the potential to grow into a new nut tree. So the nut strategy is something that makes no sense in isolation. It is entirely reliant upon this suite of interactions, relies upon the hunger of the squirrels and the other predators of the nut, It relies upon the handling time necessary to process the nut. It relies upon all of the predators of the squirrels. It's a really complex ecological setting, but when all the pieces are in place, it works just fine, and that's why you see such a variety of nuts available when you go to the nut aisle in the grocery store.
You know, this goes back to the same domestication by plants, and now I'm thinking that humans created tools, and they kind of hacked all this evolution and sped past all of these processes. This is blowing my mind.
Yeah, I think it's that's a good use of the word hack, is to apply that to some of the ways that people have, exploited these natural systems for our own ends in terms of nutrition or all the other uses that we put plants to. But yes, we've hacked a lot of systems in our history as agricultural apes.
Wow. How did our ancestors tell whether you could consume a certain seed or a nut or any of those kind of things, or whether it's going to kill me right away? Was it by trial by fire?
Yeah, I think trial and error is a big part of it. There's, for wild primates, you often see new foods entering the diet of wild primates through the experimentation of young ones. Right, the diet, the dietary practices in gorillas or chimpanzees or various monkeys and things are learned for the most part, but there's also an element of experimentation, and it's often younger animals that do the experimenting, and sometimes with dire results. So there's no reason to believe that our ancestors would have behaved differently. Experimentation is a part of learning about the environment around you and what you can eat and what you can't. But of course, as we mentioned earlier, that the sense of bitterness that we get from plants is it's there for a reason. We recognize it as unpalatable for a reason. This is something that could be harmful to us. And from the plant's perspective, we want to make it seem harmful to these potential consumers so that they do not devour this part of the plant. So certainly trial and error is a very important part of diets anywhere.
Fascinating. So how long do seeds and nuts and all of them last? Is there a theme going on over here at all?
Yeah, well, again, thinking about the great variety of plants that are out there, and we have at least 250,000 by some counts, over 300,000 different kinds of seed plants in the world, and they are adapted to every continent. Really, there are 2 native seed plants in Antarctica as well. So everywhere that you go, seed plants dominate the flora, and they dominate floras as different as a desert and a mountain meadow and a tropical rainforest. And each of those ecological settings may have or put different demands upon a plant in terms of how best to distribute and disperse its seed for generating that next and future generations. And that gives rise to a huge variety of strategies, if you will, from the plant's perspective on dispersal and the longevity of seeds. So if you are in a place like a tropical rainforest where it's wet and warm most of the time, your seeds might be able to germinate and grow right away. So you may not put a lot of evolutionary energy, to coin a term there, or evolutionary attention into longevity of your seeds, because if you get them out there, they're ready to go. You might have a different strategy in mind. You might do something like that avocado we were talking about earlier, which really doesn't have a dormant period at all. You can sprout an avocado seed straight out of the fruit you get from the grocery store, just with 3 toothpicks and a glass of water, and in a few weeks you've got your avocado growing right away. It doesn't get dormant at all, and wouldn't last for a long time in a dried out condition. It would die. And you can contrast that with seeds that can lie dormant in the soil for tens or even hundreds of years, waiting for the right conditions in which to grow in a place, like a grassland where maybe you're in a temperate area with a severe winter. Well, you don't want your seeds to sprout at the wrong time and be killed by a frost. And so they may be, adapted to lasting for months or years, and they may in fact require certain characteristics in the environment before they're even ready to sprout. They may need to go through a cold snap before they can germinate, and that would be, in their natural setting, the passage of winter, right? And so they won't sprout until they've felt that cold. They won't come out of their dormancy until a cold snap has happened, indicating to the seed that suddenly spring is on the way, and it might be a fortunate time for them to sprout. So if you talk about this idea of dormancy and the longevity of seed, how long do these things last? It really boils down to another aspect of dispersal that we rarely consider. I mean, we're used to thinking about seeds dispersing through space, dispersing away from the parent plant. Eating that apple and dispersing the seeds away from the plant. This makes sense to us. You carry the fruit away and you spit out or poop out or drop the seeds someplace else. That makes sense. But plants also have the ability to disperse their seeds through time. And that boils down to this idea of dormancy. And it stems from the fact that not all times are created equal from a plant's perspective for the process of germination and growing a baby plant. There are times that are good and times that are bad, and that changes drastically in different settings. If you are in an environment that is adapted to wildfires, the best time for seeds to germinate and grow is after a fire comes through and clears out the competition and drops a bunch of nutrients in the soil in the form of ash. Hey, that's a great time for plants to germinate. And so you see a lot of fire-adapted plants that have very long-lived seed that respond to heat or the chemical signature of wood smoke or some other signal that they wait for before they germinate. If you are in, as we mentioned, a cold place, it may require cold to bring you out of dormancy because the spring is a better time than the winter to germinate. So all of these different environmental conditions give rise to different strategies for dormancy and this idea of dispersal through time.
What kind of countermeasures have they developed to prevent them from being destroyed in certain harsh conditions like the heat, extreme heat, or extreme cold?
Oh, yeah. So a lot of that has to do with, the location that seeds spend this dormant period. And, they are in the soil, which is, a place that is, it certainly has its own risks in terms of, fungi and bacterial decomposition and all kinds of things that you need to resist, oftentimes through chemicals or through hard shells or some of the things we've talked about in terms of plant defenses and seed defenses. But also you benefit from being hidden from the worst damage of weather and sun and other things. You're down in the soil, and keep in mind that that soil is moved around in a lot of systems too. There are worms and other creatures that shift that soil. There's frost heave, so seeds move around in the soil bank, and over time they may find themselves in a position to germinate or not. If they're too deep, if the light conditions aren't right, they won't germinate, and it may be years and years before they are cycled up through some soil process into a spot that is right for germination. So there are all kinds of ways to stay safe, but a part of it is just the fact that they are in fact in the soil, which is buffered against the extremes of weather.
What gives the seed its impenetrable structure or really hard structure that it has?
So the hard structure, well, there are a couple of ways. Some seeds, of course, aren't really very hard at all, and
Fair
there
enough.
are seeds that are soft and have few defenses at all. If you look at the harder structures around seed, they're going to be using, oftentimes lignin, the same thing that makes, woody plants tough, those will be used. Those kinds of cells that cells with a lot of lignin will be used in a seed coat or a shell to protect the seed within. So the same sorts of structural options that the plant uses to build itself are there when it uses for it to use when it tries to protect a seed.
Okay, so one of the interesting things that I've noticed is when I consume nuts, for example, almonds or maybe peanuts or any of those, there's an outer sort of fibrous layer to it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's how did that come into? I don't know. Am I making sense?
Sure. Yeah. So if you look at the typical sort of nut, you'll have what we call the shell. Generally speaking, and then inside that, the nut itself has a thin papery coating oftentimes, or fibrous or papery coating around it, which is technically the seed coat. And it's structurally speaking, the seed coat itself is seed material. The shell might be material that derived, structurally and in terms of development from fruit tissue. So there's a certain, distinction, botanically speaking, about the origin of these structures. But depending on the species of nut or seed, these things are built in different ways, and you can find the defensive chemicals or the defensive structure either in that shell-like part, or sometimes, in some cases, it is in the seed coat part itself. But when you see that little fibrous coating, for most nuts, you're looking at a true seed coat.
Okay. And how does the decay process work? Like, for example, I have a seed with me, and after, let's say, 6 months, it's not going to work. It's dead. So how do I deduce that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And again, when you're talking about dormancy in seeds, there are all these strategies that we were talking about. And you might want a seed that doesn't need to be dormant at all in the rainforest, or one that will benefit from decades or hundreds of years of dormancy in a drier setting. And so the breakdown that occurs in seeds is really, chemical decomposition. Things just break down over time. So if you have a dormant seed sitting there, it's almost like, a bottle of a prescription medication on the shelf in your bathroom. You look on that, there's an expiration date, and the reason for that is that chemicals degrade just naturally over time. They change. And in a pill, the efficacy of the pill degrades over time, and at some point, they print the date on there, it becomes ineffective, or so ineffective that it's no longer worth taking for your headache or whatever malady you're treating. Well, for a seed, the same thing is going on. You've got chemicals in there, and they are slowly degrading over time, and a certain amount of that can occur and not affect germination. But at some point, the seed essentially dies, and will not germinate, and so your germination rates decline over time for a packet of seeds, and that's why if you are a gardener, you can save seeds for some species for many years, but others you have to end up buying every year or two because the germination rate declines, and it's just a matter of natural chemical decomposition there in the seed itself.
So here's a question that comes from a food and health perspective, which is seeds. Each seed has its own nutrient composition where it'll have its own carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Is there any sense, or is there any logic to that, or reason why a certain seed is composed in a certain way? Well, the differences that you see there have to do with the huge variety of ways that a seed can store energy. And this, comes again from the concept, evolutionarily speaking, of how you store energy for the baby plant. I mean, if you think about it, we are getting, the bulk of the calories in our diet by stealing food from babies, because that is what seed energy is designed for. It's there not for our benefit. It's there to feed the baby plant when it germinates. So from the plant's
perspective, you can store that energy in a number of ways. It can be stored as carbohydrates. It can be stored as, oils. It can be stored as fats. It can be stored in proteins, in a whole range. And you have different compositions in different seeds that vary widely. And what happens when the seed germinates then is those nutrients are mobilized changed chemically into a way that the baby plant can use them as it sprouts and grows. So this is why you see in some, nutritional advice, suggestions for eating sprouted grains at times, experimenting with these to try them, see how they work for individual people, if they are easier to digest or what have you. Because in fact, the chemistry has changed in those seeds. Once they sprout, the stored energy, whether it's carbohydrates or proteins or what have you, is being chemically changed and put into a form that the plant is now using for growth. And so they are different in some fashion. So it is, I can't tell you if they're better or worse in terms of personal nutrition, but they're certainly different. And if you think about this, you have to get our heads around the fact that, a seed is a live plant. It may be dormant for a long period of time, but it's sort of just in suspended animation. It is a live, living plant. Botanists call a seed, a baby plant in a box with its lunch. And, it's a living organism, and it's got that lunch in there, that nutrition that's designed to feed the baby plant. And because that lunch is there, well, then we can use it to fuel ourselves. And, that also leads to all these other things we've been talking about. Because the lunch is there, because that energy is there, everything wants to eat a seed, and the plant needs to defend the seed, and all of these other things come about because of all that nutrition.
I feel bad about consuming plants now because they seem to, think of how many I've consumed by now. So I don't know.
I know you're eating babies every handful of peanuts.
Oh man. Speaking of all of this, what about plant intelligence? Is there a concept such as that?
Well, there's certainly been a lot of interesting research recently about communication, among plants in a way that that is sort of pushing our understanding of what it means to be intelligent or to have communication. There's been some of this known for quite some time, that if a plant is damaged, it can put off a chemical response to that injury. Say a deer is chewing on the leaves of a plant, that surrounding plants can recognize and increase the defenses in their own leaves as a response. So there are certain amounts of communication that we've known about, and I think there's, I'm not a specialist on it, but I do know there's quite a lot of research now going on in the area of plant communication, and not only through, chemical recognition among plants, but through connections that may exist through soil fungi and other, biological connections that we're just beginning, I think, to get our heads around.
Fun question. What came first, plant or the seed?
Yeah, of course, I wrote a book about seeds, so I've got to throw my lot in with the seed.
Do people ask that often?
I always put my lot in with the seed, but of course there's no way to particularly answer that for a particular species of plant. Though we do have, in terms of plant reproduction, other ways that plants reproduce, particularly if you start looking at things like algae and or the spore plants. There are these other systems. But if you're just talking about a chicken or egg type question about a particular kind of plant, I always vote for the seed. Just a matter of principle.
Sounds good. So throughout this period that you wrote your book, by the way, you've written more than just one book, and I think we could do podcasts about every single one of them. What kind of paradoxes that you noticed while doing your research really stuck out and were like, wow, I did not expect that?
So puzzles and paradoxes. Well, there's a lot of curious things out there. It's something we've already talked about, but I'm totally fascinated with the evolutionary conundrums, if you will, that plants come up against in terms of dispersing seed, for example. We talked about how, if a nut is going to be dispersed, that is a really complicated ecological situation because you're sacrificing the baby plant, or sacrificing many of them in the hopes that a few will get dispersed, and it's reliant upon a really complex system. And I think thinking from the plant perspective brings about all of these interesting conundrums and parallels that you start to see in other aspects of nature as well. I mean, we talked about how being a stationary organism like a plant leads to the evolution of chemical defenses, alkaloids, and all of these chemicals in plants that we're familiar with because we use them for a whole variety of things, from pharmaceuticals to drugs to poisons and what have you. We're very familiar with plant chemistry in daily life, really. And if you look around then, well, where else do you see these things developing? I find it totally fascinating that the other major place in nature where alkaloids have developed is in intertidal creatures, animals that live in the intertidal zone that are fixed to the rock, or that live in a coral reef environment where they are fixed in place, where they don't move. And as soon as you stop moving, you've got to figure out a way to fight back, and you fight back through chemicals. And so it's this, finding these ecological settings that come up with similar solutions. I just find completely fascinating.
Yes, and your book delves a lot into all of these different ecosystems and this battleground that's raging on. It's just so fascinating. I couldn't help but send you an invite when I finished your book. So,
well, I'm glad that you did. I'm sorry to say I'm running short on time now, but I'm very much enjoying chatting with you, and would be happy to chat more about seeds or about various other things that I've written about over the years. So it's certainly been a pleasure.
Yeah. So let's wrap it up. So how can people find you, or do you have any final plugs or anything you want to tell people?
Oh, sure. If you're interested, I do have a website which is THORHANSON, thorhanson.net. You can find me anytime there, and links to all sorts of interesting related materials.
Okay, and let's tell them the books that you've written just real quick.
Sure. So we've been talking today about one called The Triumph of Seeds. I have a new book coming out in July about bees, and that is called Buzz, The Nature and Necessity of Bees. I've also written a book titled Feathers about the evolution and natural history and cultural history of feathers, and then a book called The Impenetrable Forest, which is about mountain gorillas in Uganda, and finally a kid's book called Bartholomew Quill, which is about a young crow on a quest.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Thor. You have been a blast, and I swear we could have done this for hours.
Oh, yeah, we were just getting started, weren't we? Hey, it was a lot of fun, Fahad. I really appreciate your interest.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Sure thing. Take care now.
Thank you for listening to the show. You can visit us at ketogeek.com to check out our premium, keto-friendly, and low-carb food products, including our infamous energy pods, made from the best ingredients we could find in the entire country. We also recommend signing up for our newsletter at ketogeek.com/signup, where you get exclusive discounts, rewards, product announcements, and the latest content we are working on. You also get a 10% discount on your entire order when you sign up. Go to ketogeek.com/signup to join the low-carb playground.